Hello and welcome to BBC Parliament's recorded coverage from the Select Committee rooms. The Home Affairs Committee held a two-part session looking at drugs policy and the work of the Home Secretary.
Good morning, Mr. Brand. Thank you.
Good morning.
Please have a seat. Mr. Brand, Mr. Summers, thank you for giving evidence to the committee's inquiry into drugs. Mr. Russell Brand, you gave evidence, written evidence to this committee, which members of the committee have read. Could I start with a point about what you say in your evidence? That you disagree with the legalisation of drugs because you think that a deterrent effect is necessary. Is that right?
I don't feel entirely qualified to talk about legislation. For me, what's more significant is the way that we socially regard the condition of addiction. It's something that I consider to be an illness and therefore more a health matter than a criminal or judicial matter. I don't think that legalisation is something that I've, as I said, particularly qualified to get into. I can see areas, in fact, where decriminalisation might be considered useful and more efficient. You know, in like countries like Portugal or Switzerland, where there's been trials, it seems to have had some efficacy. But for me, it's more important that we regard people suffering from addiction with compassion, and that there's a pragmatic rather than symbolic approach to treating it. And I think the legislative status of addiction and the criminalisation of addicts is kind of symbolic and not really functional. I don't see how it especially helps. But I'm not saying let's have a wacky free-for-all where people go around taking drugs. Didn't help me much.
You're a former heroin addict.
Yeah.
Briefly, could you tell us how you got onto drugs and then how you managed to come off it and how many years you were on hard drugs?
I see you've incorporated the word briefly now into the question, as you've already noticed my propensity for verbosity. I became a drug addict, I think, because of emotional difficulties, psychological difficulties, and perhaps a spiritual malady. For me, taking drugs and excessive drinking were the result of a psychological, spiritual, or mental condition. So they're symptomatic. I was like sad, lonely, unhappy, detached, and drugs and alcohol for me seemed like a solution to that problem. Once I dealt with the emotional, spiritual, mental impetus, I no longer felt the need to take drugs or use drugs. I got clean actually at Chip Summers' facility, Focus 12, which is abstinence-based recovery. And that's what we essentially believe in, is that if you have the disease or the illness of addiction or alcoholism, the best way to tackle it is to not use drugs in any form, whether it's state-sponsored opiates like methadone or illegal street drugs or illegal substance like alcohol. We see no distinction between these substances. What we believe in is that abstinence-based recovery is the best solution for people suffering from this condition, and the support structures exist to get people to maintain recovery, abstinence-based recovery. What we want is more research and funding into abstinence-based recovery and to be able to filter people towards this new lifestyle, which actually criminalisation becomes less of an issue in my view, because it takes people that have to indulge in criminal activity to fund their habits and gets them into being valuable members of society.
Now,
was that brief enough?
Very brief, thank you. You were arrested roughly 12 times.
It was rough, yes.
By the police and the justice system. Do you think that when you were arrested that you had the kind of support that you needed, and people like you who were arrested being involved in drugs, the rehabilitation and the support that was needed to get you off drugs? How did the criminal justice system react to you after your arrests?
From my experience speaking to people in the criminal justice system, and from my own personal experience being arrested, there's some confusion and ignorance around addiction, and it's quite understandable because a lot of drug addicts, like speaking personally, are antisocial. They are a strain on society. They necessarily engage in criminal activity. They're a public nuisance in many ways. I felt when I was arrested that the police were doing a necessary job of enforcing the laws of this country, and they were doing what they had to do. But it wasn't until I had access to abstinence-based recovery that I was able to change my behaviour and significantly reduce, all but obliterate, my criminal activity, apart from the occasional skirmish.
Final question from me on this section is the issue of legal highs. We've been very concerned in the evidence that we've received about the number of legal highs that are available, and young people who seem to be able to take legal highs. Whenever they are banned or proposed to be banned, a new legal high emerges. Do you think that this is something that does affect young people? Is this now the drug of choice for young people?
I don't know, because I'm not young enough anymore, but I know that young people will always want to get high, and I think that what we need is a pragmatic approach to this. In a way, for me, as I said before, Keith, it's insignificant, the substance that they're using, whether it's alcohol, illegal street drugs. The legal status of a drug is irrelevant to a drug addict. If you're a drug addict, you're getting drugs. That's it. You're going to get them. So, it's, in a way, it's probably best to make it simple. As for legal highs, what I think we need to do is address the social, mental and spiritual problems that are leading young people or people of all ages to taking drugs. And so I think what we need is research into abstinence-based recovery and more awareness around it.
On to some of those points with other questions. Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Chair. You're currently working on a programme about addiction and how it's viewed in society. What messages are you hoping to get across in that programme?
The messages that we're hoping to get across in this programme is that maintenance of drug addiction through state-sponsored substances like methadone should only be deployed as part of a reduction with the ultimate aim of abstinence-based recovery. That we need to start regarding addiction in all its forms as a health issue as opposed to a judicial and criminal issue. That we need to change the laws in this country, and we need to have a more compassionate, altruistic, loving attitude to the people with the disease of addiction, and recognise that these people with the proper help, access to the proper treatment, can become active and helpful members of society, like myself, some would argue that point, or perhaps more obviously Chip Summers, who, a man with a criminal record as long as your arm, now runs a treatment centre and has been clean for 27 years. That's the message, that we don't want to discard people, we don't want to life them off on methadone and leave them on the sidelines. We need to bring them in to society, offer them treatment, and once again neutralise the toxic social threat that they offer as criminals, because they have to fund their habit, or even if it's a legal drug like alcohol, they're clattering into things, driving drunk, pain in the arse people. We need to offer them treatment and activate them and incorporate them into our society. So the message is ultimately one of pragmatism, altruism and compassion in all areas of the condition.
Thank you. Mr Summers, we will have specific questions for you, but if you want to chip in, if I may put it like that, at any stage, please feel free to do so, but we do have... Is there anything you want to add from what you've heard so far?
Splendidly.
Thanks, Chip. Chip runs the treatment centre where I got clean. So
yes, we're coming on to him in a minute, Mr Brand.
He's already the puppeteer behind each and every articulation.
Thank you, Mr Brand. Michael Ellis has a question for you.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Mr Brand, you've said that addiction is an illness.
Yes.
But would you say that it's also fair to characterise it to a large extent as self-induced?
Not really.
Like many other illnesses, and also that it does carry with it victims. Many people who are on drugs commit offences against other people, do they not? So it differs in that respect as well, doesn't it? And when one's looking at the criminal justice system, doesn't one also have to have some compassion and consideration for the victims of crime where those crimes are committed by people under the influence of drugs?
Michael, I'm very glad you've asked me that question. It's a very important question. It's one that we need to address. Of course, the victims of acquisitive drug-related crimes are important and need to be taken care of. We were with Chief Superintendent Graham Bartlett the other day of Sussex Police, a wonderful man, a good civic-minded gentleman. It's his belief that by regarding addiction as an illness, by offering treatment instead of a more punitive approach, we can prevent people from committing crimes. Just personally, I was a criminal when I was a drug addict by virtue of my addiction and the ways that I had to acquire money to get drugs. Anecdotally, Chip was an armed robber in and out of Nick all the time. I hope you don't mind me telling them this. And other people I've met, You know, like, criminality is a necessary component. Now, of course, we're not saying forget the victims, but I'm saying it's better to address the social situation pragmatically. And I think we all know this. By prescribing methadone to people, most people on methadone are using illegal drugs to supplement their habit. They're not addressing the root problems. We need to approach the victims with respect. Where there has been criminal behaviour, it needs to be dealt with correctly. But perhaps within the penal system itself, we can offer treatment to addicts, like the brilliant work that's done by RAPT in various institutions and prisons.
So you'd say there needs to be a carrot and stick, would you?
I don't think there needs to be a carrot or a stick. Both of those things seem like bizarre metaphors. I think what there needs to be is love and compassion to everybody involved. If people are committing criminal behaviour, then it needs to be dealt with legally, but you need to offer them treatment, not simply out of some airy-fairy that's all old hands and hug liberalism, but because it deals with the problem and it prevents further crimes being committed. Addicts that get clean at one day at a time through abstinence-based recovery, generally speaking, stop committing crimes. That's better for victims, it's better for the addict, it's better for society.
Ellis?
The role that celebrities play in society is not insignificant. And I want to ask you whether...
I'd argue that it is insignificant, and that's why they play that role.
Perhaps it should be more than it is. But what I want to know from you, Mr. Brand, is whether you think that having got out of the cycle of addiction,
yes,
and I congratulate you for that.
Thank you.
Whether you would like to position yourself as a role model in society for those who might look to you as an example.
As the great Tupac Shakur said, role is something people play, model is something that people make. Both of those things are fake. What I want to offer people is truth and authenticity in the treatment of this illness, in our regard to the criminal components of it, in assisting victims, and in the way we legislate and organise our society. I can't be responsible, as you know, you lot hold committees all the time about the reprehensible behaviour of our media. What the cipher of my image is used to represent in the media, I have no control over.
You do, because your behaviour is some aspect of what's portrayed about you, isn't it?
Well, yes, of course, but however, how's this going to be written up? This could be written up as Michael Ellis, he's sprawled on a pin there by the wit of Brand, or they could say the recalcitrant former drug addict rambled on. If you read it in the Telegraph, it's going to say one thing. If you read it in the Socialist Worker, it's going to say another thing.
A combination.
Of course, the objective behaviour has got components, but I'm saying that what I want to offer people is truth and authenticity, and I think celebrity, as we all know, is a vapid, vacuous, toxic concept used to distract people from what's actually important, and in this case that's treatment of people with a disease of addiction.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Summers.
As far as we were concerned, those people who are brave enough, who are both celebrities and recovering addicts, have a profound effect on the number of people who seek treatment, because it gives out a very positive message that recovery is possible. And when Russell Brand's book came out, the number of referrals to our treatment centre was just hugely exaggerated, because people suddenly discovered that treatment was possible, help was possible, and it was better, and people could get better, and it made a profound difference. And I would hope that actually more people in the public eye, whether they be, well, I suppose by celebrities they are in the public eye, will come forward and have the bravery to do so, because it does encourage people.
So celebrities can be a very positive role.
Absolutely. But of course then it can backfire as well when people make a big fuss about being in recovery and then relapse, and of course that's unfortunate, but we're fortunate with Russell that he's maintaining a good recovery, and that continues to be a good role model.
Brand, do you think more people need to know about things like cocaine production, where cocaine comes from? The committee went to Colombia to look at the effects that the harvesting of cocaine was having on the people of Colombia, who are extraordinarily poor and were forced to be involved in this kind of activity. Do you think if there was more focus on where it all came from and how it affected communities, that would help stop people getting involved?
No, Keith, no more than the industrial consequences of oil production affect people using their cars. People don't care about industry, people care about getting the resource that they require. The illegality makes no difference, the consequences in the nation of origin makes no difference. I think what we need is to address the emotional, mental and spiritual problems that lead to addiction. Of course, any illegal industry or the cocaine manufacture in South American nations or wherever has a negative consequence for their nations, but I don't think that that's something that individual drug addicts are going to be affected by, to be honest, because they're normally on drugs.
Thank you very much. Lorraine Fulbrook has some questions to Mr. Summers.
I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Summers. Focus 12 has 3 high-profile patrons, Mr.
Yes.
Brand, Davina McCall
Yeah.
and Boy George. And that's something that was probably unthinkable about 50 years ago.
Yes.
Do you think that has led to the destigmatisation of addiction, or do you think it's led to a wider acceptance of drug use in society in general?
I don't think it's encouraged people to use drugs. I think there have been some people who have made a sort of positive...
Sorry, love.
I was right in the middle of my answer then.
Still a good speech. It's just got some ladies going by.
I think that the public is fine. Yes, Mr. Summers.
Yeah, I've completely forgotten where I was.
Because you was flirting with him.
It's about high-profile patrons
Oh, yeah.
and destigmatisation, or does it?
I think there are
lead to
certain
wider
celebrities who have made a sort of positive message about drug use, which has not helped the situation at all. I think most people who get better from drug addiction are a very positive influence. But I think there are some celebrities, obviously, who have probably contributed to people using drugs because they make it look glamorous, they make it look interesting, and I don't suppose that helps. But I think as long as, while they're using, they will tend to do that. But if they stop using, then they obviously become a very positive role model. But I do think there are some celebrities who have made the matter worse. I don't think on a national scale it's made a huge difference. I think there are 1 or 2 people who are influenced by that. But I don't think it's...
As the chief executive of Focus, I mean,
Yeah.
how do you pick your celebrities, as it were?
the ones that get clean, I'll grab them. Yeah.
Very helpful. Nicola Blackwood.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate you on your work on abstinence-based work. I think that it's very effective, and I share your suspicion about long-term methadone maintenance. But I was struck by your comments about the problems of highlighting drug use in communities. And do you think that we're doing enough, or do you think that there's a risk that our harm reduction based approaches to drugs education are giving a false impression that there are some drugs which are safe if they're used correctly?
I think we are not doing anything like enough to give an honest answer to the problems of drugs. I think we are giving a rather clouded message about drug use. I think there's a lot more that we could be doing about honestly educating people about drugs. I don't think we address it and take it on board properly enough. And I feel that we should be doing much more, especially at an educational level. We should be giving honest education, and I don't think there are many schools that are giving honest education to young people. We've been educating young people now for 15 years, and it hasn't had a major influence on the number of drug use. I think we need to change how we're doing the education of young people, particularly.
Well, how? Because
by giving more honest information. It's no good just going into schools and saying drugs are bad, stop it. Because in each of those schools there will be people who are using cannabis, who are using ketamine, who are using ecstasy. Not all the school, but some of them will be. And if you don't give people both the good and the bad of drug use, they won't listen to you. Because there are lots of people in schools who are smoking cannabis and not dropping dead. You have to give both the positive and the negative side of it. I don't think we're doing that. I think we're giving too much of the negative side of it and not giving honest information. Unless it's honest, people won't listen.
Thank you. Dr. Julian Huppert wants to.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Summers, you're an advocate for abstinence-based
Very much so.
approaches. You presumably know there's been work by Professor Strang, for example, published in The Lancet, which showed that there was good evidence for methadone maintenance and very high cost effectiveness, fairly good for heroin maintenance, and a lack of evidence for abstinence. Do you think that abstinence is the answer for everybody, or are you arguing that there are people for whom it is a very good option?
I think it is an admirable aim for everybody. Not everybody can achieve it. Not everybody can give up smoking. But I think it is. I think there's a really good purpose for methadone usage at a certain stage. But just to park people on methadone for 4 to 7 years and more is criminal, really. I mean, just to keep people locked into that addiction, because methadone usage is a dependency. You're totally dependent. I think it has a role, but I think it gets overused, and I think we just tend to use it as a response to everything, and we don't do enough to intervene. I think it would be an admirable aim for everybody. I don't think methadone usage is a good thing. I see very few people on methadone who are leading good, stable lives. I think most of the people who are using methadone are also using other drugs on top. If I saw it producing good stability, I would be much more in favour of it. I don't see that. What I do see is that people who are abstinent lead good, clean and decent lives, but obviously not everybody can achieve it.
I think that suggests further research is needed to check the results. Can I also just ask, really, for both of you, because obviously we have finite resources to spend. If we're going to spend more money on treatment, and if we're going to spend more money on education, money has to be taken from somewhere. I mean, one possible suggestion is that we spend less money on doing the policing of possession, for example. Yeah. Is that something which you would support, or would you see things in a different way?
I think that's a brilliant idea, as a matter of fact, and I think that there's people within the criminal justice services that share that view. I think that, yeah, you've got to appropriate these resources from somewhere, and as already been brought up, mate, in here, it's like that. It's not penalising people for the possession of drugs is costly and expensive. A good number of times I was arrested was simply for possession, and the administrative costs of that would be better spent, I think, on education and addressing and treatment. I think that would be a very, very sensible use of those redirected funds.
Mr. Summers?
Mr. Summers?
I feel like I'm at school now because I've forgotten the question.
Like, do you think instead of nicking people for possession, I should stick it into treatment and education?
Thank you for that translation, Mr. Bryant. Mr. Summers?
I think there's an awful lot of money wasted on small-time possession of small amounts of drugs, which are just part and parcel of the daily hustle and bustle of using. I think there is an awful lot of police time wasted on that. And I'm not saying that we should legalise it, but I think if we could get rid of some of that, because that sort of just minor possession is just part of the everyday life of being an addict. And, it would be... I certainly think there's a massive difference between decriminalising and legalising. I think it's good to treat it as a health issue rather than a criminal issue, but I'm not in favour of legalising things. But I think we do waste a lot of money, unfortunately, on minor.
You spent quite a lot of time in prison on accounts of possession.
Yes, I did.
But also armed robbery to get drugs.
I think Nicola Blackwood...
Should we even trust you?
Mr. Brown, I think Nicola Blackwood has a quick supplementary.
Thank you, Chair. There's quite a gap between education and full-blown addiction and treatment for abstinence. And in that gap, you have first use and so on. And what you need is intervention during that period to prevent addiction and sort of prevention. And some of that prevention is perhaps first arrest for prevention and diversion programmes. Are you suggesting that we should be removing all spending on those intermediate steps in drugs policy?
No, I think we should do it better.
Okay.
Thank you. Chairman, I'd like to ask both the gentlemen, what are your views on decriminalisation or legalisation of drugs?
Chip's already been pretty clear on the subject. I'm not a legal expert. I'm saying that it's, to a drug addict, the legal status is irrelevant. It's at best an inconvenience. If you need to get drugs because you're a drug addict, you're going to get drugs regardless of their legal status. So the more money you waste in administering and controlling that, I think there's a futility.
So would you be in favour or not?
Yeah, I think, to tell you the truth, yes, I would. I think that there's a degree of cowardice and sort of willful ignorance around this condition. I think a good many people here, like if you think about it, like sort of we all know someone who's affected by alcoholism or addiction, and it's something that we increasingly need to handle compassionately and pragmatically. The criminal and legal status, I think, sends the wrong message. But I wouldn't start banging a drum, as I said before, to make drugs legal, because I don't take any drugs and I don't drink because for me they're bad. I just think we need to recognise the distinction that certain people have a condition or a tendency that drugs and alcohol are going to ruin their lives. We need to identify those people and offer them the correct treatment.
Thank you.
So,
Mr. Summers, do you agree with decriminalisation or legislation?
I think there's a real argument for decriminalising it so that it gets treated like a health issue rather than a legal issue. However, I think there's a massive difference between that and legalising drugs. I think you really find it very difficult to justify the legal use of a lot of drugs. You can't really justify the legal use of heroin, crack cocaine, or any of those drugs. There's no medical or legal reason why people should be able to use those drugs. So I think you would be hard-pressed to... I think that cannabis is probably the one you could make an argument for.
But you wouldn't support the legalisation of cannabis?
I think it's the one that is most likely to be... the one that you've got a chance of kind of actually sort of putting forward an argument of justification. I don't think there's any justification for the legalisation.
Yes, of course. Lorraine Fulbright has an argument.
But if you legalise or decriminalise cannabis, you're not taking away the problem. We've seen the other end where there is a serious and organised crime issue and the narco-terrorism issue, which ruins people's lives. I mean, murders people, has people, and it causes conflict in countries. So, I mean,
I'm not advocating the legalisation of cannabis. I'm just saying that if there was any drug at all that you could put forward an argument for legal, cannabis is the one you've got the best chance with. But there's no... How on earth do you justify the usage of heroin or crack cocaine or anything like that?
Making it illegal is not working anyway, Chip, so it's not like, you know, I just think that there needs to be honesty and authenticity around this issue so that people in Parliament don't look like they're out of touch. So yes. I think it's really good that you're holding this committee, but some of this information is already accessible.
Thank you. Final question from Mr. Ellis.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, I think you both referred to a preference for ignoring what you described as the more minor offending in relation to drugs. Can I suggest to you that a lot of the more minor offending leads to some of the more major offending, and that actually what one is doing if one was to ignore those types of offences would be to make the matter worse, both for society who is suffering under the increased levels of crime, but also for the offender who would be less likely to learn the lessons of having been arrested and be more likely to get worse.
Arresting, let me just interrupt for a bit, because otherwise it's like they're telling us what to do. Being arrested isn't a lesson, it's just an administrative blip. You need to demonstrate an awareness of the situation. Yes, of course, in many ways the disease or the condition of addiction does exacerbate, and if you start taking drugs it's likely you'll take worse drugs, and if you're taking expensive drugs you will end up committing crime. But again, mate, what we need to identify is a degree of authenticity and compassion in the way we deal with this problem. Otherwise you just seem like you don't know what you're talking about.
Crime.
We've talked about them. You can tell what party they're in from their questions, innit?
What about the victims of the crime?
I think all parties are interested in victims of crime.
Of course we are. That's what we're saying. We're not saying that they ignore victims.
I think we're running out of time. I have a final question about...
Time is infinite.
Unfortunately,
we cannot run out of time.
It is. But for this committee...
Who's next? Theresa May? She may not show up. Check she knows what day it is.
Mr. Brand, I have a final question for you.
It's not quite a variety show, Mr. Brand.
You're providing a little bit of variety, though.
Mr. Brand, you have...
Making it more like Dad's Army.
Mr. Brand, you have 4.5 million Twitter followers.
Oh, yes.
And 1.5 million Facebook followers. Having gone through addiction and then rehabilitation, what is your message to young people who want to get involved in drugs? What would you say to them about the effects that it has?
My message isn't for young people. My message is for people that have this condition of addiction. If you have the condition of addiction, there is help available for you, and I recommend abstinence-based recovery. I think some people can safely take drugs. I think they can, as long as it doesn't turn them into criminals or harm their health. Then I don't feel like it's any of my business. You know, so I'm not here to do some Just Say No stuff. The kids that sung that Just Say No were all taking drugs in the White House when they were visiting Nancy Reagan. It's a further demonstration of the disjunct between reality and authenticity. Let's have an authentic, truthful, honest debate and some funding for abstinence-based recovery.
Mr. Summers, do you have anything to add to that? With the work, the excellent work you're doing in your charity?
I tend to deal with what... I mean, I get very muddled in all the kind of legalisation, decriminalisation. What I tend to do is deal with the problem when it exists, and I agree completely that when those people come into treatment, they have damaged a lot of people in the public. They are harming at least 4 or 5 other people in their families who are significantly distressed by that behaviour. And I try and prevent that, and I think the best way of preventing that in a long-term basis is ultimately abstinence treatment. I think that's when you stop causing harm to families, stop causing harm to the public, and that's your best chance, because at the moment I see people who are not in abstinence programmes still continuing to cause distress to families and the public.
Mr. Summers, Mr. Brown, thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. And thank you for your written evidence.
Thank you.
Order, could we have our next witnesses, please? Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Mr. Hitchens, Ms. Gyngell, Mr. Brett.
Thank you. It's Mrs. Gyngell.
Gyngell. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Now, thank you very much for coming to give evidence. As you know, the committee is conducting an inquiry into drugs policy, all aspects of drugs policy. Mr. Hitchens, if I could start with you, you've been quite critical of successive governments, including to some extent the terms of reference of our inquiry, because I think you have a feeling that all this strategy does not result in government and Parliament being tough on those who use drugs. Is that your view? Are you worried about the way in which drug strategy is developed?
Well, the simple summary in my view is this, that most discussion on drug policy in Britain today is based on the following false logic. That there has been an attempt at serious prohibition of drug use. That attempt at serious prohibition has failed. Therefore, we should abandon any future attempt at serious prohibition. The truth is, and it's easily examined, if you look, for instance, at arrest figures, if you look at Lord Hailsham's instructions to magistrates dating back to 1973, that this country abandoned any serious attempt to prohibit the use and possession, particularly of cannabis, but also actually of Class A drugs, many years ago, and that we have informally and without admission a system of decriminalisation in this country more advanced than in either Portugal or the Netherlands, and that to argue on the basis of that prohibition has failed and that we should therefore have even less of it is not merely false and mistaken, but actually unhinged.
That's very helpful. Mary Brett.
Sorry.
The government's overall strategy. Do you think that it's going in the right direction? Indeed, the new strategy.
The new strategy. If they do what they say, I'm in drug education, really. If they do what they say and stop people from ever taking drugs in the first place, I'll be absolutely delighted. They say that they will give accurate and reliable information, and that isn't out there at the moment. But if that's altered, yes, I'm happy with it. It makes a change from the harm reduction education, which has been in vogue for the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, something like that.
Ms. Gyngell?
No, I agree that the war on drugs is a you would like to say reports of my death have been much exaggerated. I mean, this is something that hasn't happened. We have got de facto decriminalisation. As Mr. Brandt said, being arrested is an administrative blip if it indeed happens. If anything happens after arrest, you're even luckier. I think since class cannabis was reclassified to Class B, in effect, all we have had is a majority of cases of warnings. So children haven't been protected, there hasn't been proper intervention, and unfortunately, there aren't the type of intervention programmes following that initial arrest or warning that do help children and stop them from continuing.
Mr. Hitchens, you've been absolutely clear you're against decriminalisation. But you probably followed events in South America, where following the visit of President Obama, indeed before he visited Colombia recently, the heads of government of South American countries all saying that we have to have a debate about decriminalisation because the so-called war on drugs, and this is where they agree with you, has not really worked. Is there no possibility, do you think, of any form of decriminalisation to try and deal with the drugs barons who tend to run these
Mr. Chairman, we have decriminalisation. We've had decriminalisation in this country since the passage of the Misuse of Drugs Act, a bipartisan measure, in 1971, and particularly since its implementation after Lord Hailsham's speech to the Magistrates Association in October of 1973, when he instructed magistrates to cease sending people to prison for cannabis possession, which has then grown over the years into a reduction of penalties for that drug to such an extent that the prime police response to a cannabis arrest now is something called the cannabis warning, which doesn't even have your legislative seal on it. It was created entirely administratively by the Association of Chief Police Officers and does have no legislative force, nor does it have any criminal force. Cannabis in this country is effectively decriminalised. Therefore, and one could point out further if you want me to go into this, because of an answer obtained actually by Nicola Blackwood some months ago, that the actual performance of the criminal justice system towards Class A drugs is not much stronger. So we have a situation of decriminalisation. To argue that to solve any problem to do with drugs, you would need to decriminalise is therefore to argue from a position say we need something which we have already got and which we have had for 30 years. The huge tragedies visited, particularly on South and Central America, are the result of the enormous self-indulgence of drug takers, consumers, in the Western world who happily take these revolting substances and create, therefore, this enormous and disastrous trade, which leads, as we know, to the tragic results which we're seeing at the moment, particularly in Mexico and other countries. That's not because of prohibitionary policy, it's because of a long-term policy of decriminalisation under which many, many people believe that effectively these drugs are legal.
Thank you. Dr. Julian Huppert.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, Ms Hitchens, I'm fascinated by what you say. As I understand, you've been arguing that there's a decriminalisation policy since the 1971 Act, which actually did the criminalisation in the first place. Currently, around 80,000 people in the UK are convicted or cautioned possession of an illegal drug every year. Now, if you think that's a decriminalised policy, how many do you think should be convicted or cautioned each year under your criminal policy?
Well, it's not the figures of convictions or arrests that you need to look at. It's the disposals of the cases when they actually come about. Now, as far back, I should point out, as 1994, John O'Connor, who was a former head of the Scotland Yard Flying Squad, said cannabis has been a decriminalised drug for some time now. Right, that's a
fascinating point. It's not actually an answer to my question.
No. Let's move on to the situation of cannabis. Right. So in 2009, we have. Excuse me a moment while I consult a note here to get this absolutely right, because it's very, very important. So in 2009, there were 162,610 cannabis cases handled by the police in England and Wales. That's the latest year for which I can obtain figures. Of these, 19,137 were dealt with through police cautions, which expire after 3 months and need not normally even be declared to employers. 11,492 resulted in penalty notices for disorder, which is an on-the-spot rebuke which generally results in no punishment of any kind. 22,478 actually ended in court, and many of them did so because they were only one of several charges against the defendant. 86,593 were dealt with by the cannabis warning, which I just discussed with you, which is nothing.
But Mr Hitchens, firstly...
The criminal justice system, if I could just make the point I'm making, the criminal justice system goes through the motions of pretending to enforce the law against drugs, but it does not actually do so. You can possess a drug which is technically illegal in this country. You can be caught in possession of it by the police, and nothing whatever will happen to you. And most people know that.
But firstly, Mr. Hitchens, we're talking about 162,000 cases, which strikes me as rather a lot. You're saying that correctly that 80,000 go through cannabis warnings. That still leaves 80,000 who are convicted or are cautioned, and that number has been the same before cannabis warning. So
cannabis warning is not a conviction.
Well, exactly.
It's nothing. It has no legal status.
Sorry, Mr. Hitchens, I'm agreeing with you on that. There are 80,000 who have cannabis warnings, round figures, and 80,000 who are convicted or cautioned. You say that is not a proper criminal policy. I'd like to know how many people you think ought to be convicted otherwise. And are you aware, for example, of the European Monitoring Centre, which has looked across Europe and found no association between the severity of sanctions and the amount of drug use?
Well, again, it depends on how you're measuring the severity of sanctions. The sanctions exist to some extent on the statute books of the countries involved, but there are no sanctions being applied. Before the 1971 Act, I think you'll find 21% of persons arrested for cannabis possession were sent to prison immediately. Before the 71 Act completely changed our laws. There was actually a sentence of imprisonment for possession of cannabis, which was frequently applied on a first offence. Now, you're caught by the police actually in possession of cannabis, and they let you go, and you don't even get a record.
Around 1,000 people every year are jailed.
Yes, I would like to come back to Dr. Huppert. The very interesting study done by the European Monitoring Centre that he refers to, in fact, not only shows that drug use in Britain is much higher than in nearly every other Western European country, and that problem drug use is about 3 times higher, but it shows that the criminalisation in the other countries that have lower drug use is much higher. The proportion of people who get convicted and sent to prison, startlingly, in this country is much lower than in the Netherlands, which actually adopt quite a rigorous approach to hard drug use and to cannabis cafes that break the law, which they do all the time.
Very helpful. Ms. Brett, do you wish to add anything on this?
No, I think the other two are much more clued up on this.
Can I just say,
yes,
President Santos actually said on the BBC before Christmas that as long as people in the UK sniff coke here or in New York or Paris, we will suffer here. We all know that. At the moment, 2% of people sniff coke here. People like Russell Brand would like us to have it believe that this is common. It is still not common. It's common in certain circles. If you decriminalise drugs, the chances are the risk you take is the rate of usage would go up to the rate of smoking, which is about 1/5 of the adult population. I wonder if any of the committee have stopped to think how they would feel about 1/5 of the cabinet, 1/5 of their children's school teachers, 1/5 of doctors or nurses, possibly being able to sniff cocaine because it is not arrestable.
Mr. Gyngell, the committee has actually met President Santos last month, and we received the same message from him, but it's good of you to remind us. Dr. Hubbard has a quick supplementary.
Yes, I think President Santos has been quite clear that he would like to have discussions about decriminalisation because he sees it as a way of significantly reducing the harms. He was very clear.
Perhaps he's given up on us reducing demand for drugs here.
He was very clear about the discussions that he would like to see on that. But can I just ask all three of you, there's a lot of question in this area as to whether people look at the actual scientific evidence for the harms, look at the actual studies which are done, and then reach a conclusion, or reach a conclusion first and then look for aspects of data that will support that. Are you all in favour of the idea that you should have evidence-based policy?
If we could have a brief answer from each, then we need to move on. Mr. Hitchens.
Well, of course I am. Who
Well,
wouldn't be?
Well, I am, but it's very abused. I mean, it can be evidence-based policy or it can be scientific tunnel vision. I mean, for example, the methadone trials that previous doctors giving evidence here say this is gold-plated evidence. What do they demonstrate scientifically? That opiate addicts like opiates. Quite frankly, they demonstrate that if you give free opiates to addicts, you will retain them in treatment for a while. They give evidence that it minorly reduces their dependency on street drugs. Other evidence shows that methadone drug deaths have gone up dramatically since this type of medicine was being used. So we have to be very careful about what counts, what's relevant and what's translatable.
Thank you. Mary Brett?
Yes, it must be given on evidence, and my particular concern is cannabis, and there's been quite a lot of discussion already about cannabis, and the facts and figures being given out about cannabis are inaccurate, they're misleading, if I talk about Frank giving out things, the information, there are grave omissions in the cannabis information, and the scientific evidence is there, but a lot of it's being ignored, and I'd like the opportunity later in the meeting to tell you.
We do have other
the
questions for you, but just quickly, do you think Frank was a success or a failure?
Sorry, do I think...
The government's initiative.
Frank. Oh, there are some very good bits about Frank, but no, I mean, there was a survey in 2010 by Adaction, which found that only 10% of children would phone Frank, would look to Frank. This is the sort of thing that's coming through, and I've had personally very negative vibes about Frank from all sorts of people.
Very good. We will come and ask you further questions on education. Michael Ellis, a quick supplementary, then Lorraine.
Mr. Chairman, just if I could ask, Mr. Hitchens, I think you referred to the self-indulgence in the use of drugs.
Yeah.
Would you support the premise that actually it's not only those who are being self-indulgent who partake in the use of drugs? I mean, do you accept that many people, certainly when they start out using drugs, are feeling unwanted and depressed and lonely and inadequate, and when they get into the first use of drugs, and that they need help, and that they are in effect victims too, and that sizable efforts need to be made towards rehabilitation rather than just punishment?
Personally, no. I think that taking drugs is a wrong thing to do. I think that there's a good reason for there being a law against it, and if people do it, they should be punished according to the law. And I think that if we'd held to that, then we would still have the levels of drug use which we had before the 1971 Act, which were minimal. And I don't think drug users should be indulged. I don't think the advocates of drug decriminalisation should be indulged either, as the previous witnesses were.
Thank you.
The other, if I could just quickly, the others. Yeah.
I have to say I do differ with Peter here. I agree with much of what Mr. Brand said about abstinence. I don't agree with his views on the legal status or otherwise of drugs. I do think drug addicts' behaviour needs confrontation, and then the follow-on should be correct and it should be supported. But I do think it should be quite conditional on a level of compliance and cooperation. I think the drug courts in America have been hugely successful, about 3,500 of them, and they have sentenced abstinence treatment. Our problem is we do not sentence abstinence treatment, we sentence people to further use of synthetic opiates.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Lorraine Fulbrook has a quick supplementary.
A quick clarification from Ms. Gyngell. You were mentioning about coke use, for example, and how it would increase to the level of smokers if it was decriminalised or legalised, and that the committee should think about that. You know, this has been a long inquiry, and we have searched all over the world on this subject. Are you making the assumption that the committee are in favour of decriminalisation or legalisation?
Well, I was worried that you took your terms of reference, or apparently appeared to, and I indeed wrote to Mr. Vaz about it, the terms of reference from the Global Commission on Drugs Policy, which is basically a highly financed legalising lobby, and that did disturb me because equally they had given out, and they were widely disseminated in the press, incorrect figures about drug use spiralling out of control globally, when indeed the UNODC shows quite clearly that it's been stable. So that did concern me, that your direction of travel may have been influenced by lobbies who are very much in favour of decriminalisation, and if that's not the case, I'm very happy to see it.
Well, can I just say, we've travelled to Turkey, to the United States, to Colombia, and we will go to Portugal as well, and we've seen many witnesses, and I think it's fair to say that every person we've seen has given us different figures. So, you know, no two figures have been the same. Well, whoever we speak to.
No, but there's only one. You either have to accept the statistics that are collected and used, and that's by the United Nations, and that's reported in a huge report every year. And unfortunately, the Global Commission slightly misused these figures or reported them incorrectly. So, and it was a difference of 30% in the case of hard drugs. So that's my only point. And you did mention them in your terms, this particular body, in the terms of reference of your inquiry.
Thank you. Please be assured the committee has not taken a view on any of these issues. That's why we're seeking evidence from the widest possible sources of witnesses, and at the end of the day we will then publish our results. We are not under the control of any individual group, as Mr. Steve McCabe will show.
Actually, I wonder if I could ask Mr. Hitchens and Ms. Gyngell this question. I wonder, from your experience, what you thought was the most effective way of schools warning children about the dangers of drugs.
Start with Mary Brett.
No, I want to come to Mary Brett. I was asking Mr. Hitchens and Ms. Gyngell, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I don't claim any particular expertise in what schools should do, but I think if you have a properly enforced law where cannabis possession, which is illegal, is punished when detected, then one of the most important things you will do is you will armour people who are under strong peer pressure from their school fellows to take drugs against that. You will give them a good reason. They can turn around and say, no, I will not do that. I don't want to risk having a criminal record. I don't want to risk never being able to travel to the United States the rest of my life. I don't think it's worth it. And one of the whole purposes of a strongly enforced and clearly set out legal prohibition of drugs is to strengthen people against that sort of pressure. And I think in schools it would be enormously useful if we had a proper law and if we enforced it and if it was seen to be enforced.
Thank you.
I agree that a clear statement about the law by people who are responsible is the thing that makes the most difference to children. The thing I found most difficult when my teenage sons were growing up was to find that cannabis had been declassified, and I had a son at one point telling me it's not against the law. I said, well, it is against the law. I think parents need the support of the law in order to be very clear with their children, and being very clear with your children is the most effective way to prevent them using drugs in the first place. And that is my own experience, and it's been borne out by my own experience. Absolute clarity about the law and the wrongness of doing this. And I think we've lost sight of that. We're very liberal, we're very casual.
Thank you very much. Now, I wondered if I could ask Ms. Brett, I read that you had said that harm prevention has no place in the classroom, and I wondered if you could explain to the committee what you meant by that and what you think about the comments we've just heard.
Well, harm reduction has its place. If you've got an addict, somebody dependent on something, then you can reduce the dose gradually and get them off. That, in my opinion, is where harm reduction belongs, not in the classroom. You stand in front of a class, you've got 30 children there, 90-odd% of them have absolutely no intentions of taking drugs. Now, the policy has been harm reduction for the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, something like that. And harm reduction assumes that children will take drugs anyway, so we need to show them how to do it safely. Now, we know there's no guaranteed safe way of taking any drug. And the other phrase that keeps cropping up all over the place is informed choice. Now, I hope to be able to explain they're not being properly informed at the moment. And hold on, we're giving them a choice to do an illegal act. We don't give them a choice to pilfer or spray graffiti or anything like that. And the choice in the QCA and DFES guidelines is from age 7. Now, 7-year-olds have extremely immature brains, I don't need to tell you that. And the other thing about children choosing is they're completely incapable, because the risk-taking part of the brain develops before the inhibitory part of the brain. So the children are most likely going to take this risk. And if you go in and give harm reduction advice to children on the assumption that they're going to take drugs anyway, which is rubbish, because 30 or 40% of children may try them, but I mean the actual use of cannabis in 11 to 15-year-olds in regular use in the last year was 4.4%. It was very, very low. So you shouldn't assume that they're going to take it. You give harm reduction advice, and on Frank there still is harm reduction advice. In other words, this is the amount of mushrooms that people use. Ecstasy, drink water, sip it, that's all harm reduction advice. And that sort of thing acts as a green light for children. And I know instances where it's happened. They've gone on to Frank's website, they've looked up the advice, they've taken the advice, and in the case of cannabis it's been removed now, but they've become psychotic.
Can I just check? I mean, I think the statement about the clear legal position is obvious. Mr. Summers seemed to suggest that one of the problems of giving advice that young people might know not to be entirely accurate is that it weakens the whole impact of your message. Do you have any sympathy with that view?
With not giving advice?
Well, he suggested that if youngsters are told things about drugs that they know perfectly well are not entirely accurate, it may lead to them dismissing the entire message that you're trying to convey. I wondered if you had any sympathy with that view.
Well, if drug education is done properly, now I was a biology teacher and I taught in a boys' grammar school for 30 years, and I know that if you give them, and I've researched cannabis for years now, I wrote a huge report, 2006, I keep it updated. I've really gone into this in a big way. And if you talk to children and explain it in a scientific way, but age appropriate, obviously, because it was a boys' school, they were interested, of course, in the scientific side anyway, and to give them the truth. Don't exaggerate, don't patronise, just talk to them as sort of equals and give them the truth, the scientific truth. They will not take drugs. People get children wrong. The vast majority of children have no intentions of taking drugs. What they want, actually, is good, accurate, really reliable information about drugs so that they can say no to their peer group. Someone mentioned peer group earlier. Kids want excuses. I know this. They used to tell me, give us more information. Parents used to take information away with them so that they could talk to their children. So if you do it honestly, clearly, are willing to be challenged, have your evidence, then you're 90-odd% there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Hitchens, is it your view that if there was a real hardline policy, more hardline than successive governments have pursued, the number of people taking drugs would substantially fall?
Yes, it is. And I think it was the case. Obviously, the arrival of cannabis in this country after the Second World War was a slow business. The number of convictions for cannabis possession in the whole United Kingdom in 1945 was 4, and in 1960, 235. Even in the early and mid-60s, it was only at a level of about 1,000. It is since the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, which was itself an implementation of Lady Baroness Wootton's report, which was not a call for legalisation, but was in effect a call for decriminalisation of cannabis particularly. The numbers have gone up immensely. In 1972, before the Act had begun to take full effect, 12,599 cases. Now we're up to 160,000 arrests a year in England and Wales alone, not including Scotland. There has obviously been an immense change. Now, you can put some of that down to social change, but how much of that social change can you attribute to the legal change and the increasing unwillingness of the legal system and the police to arrest, prosecute, or punish for cannabis possession? I think they have to be linked.
The figures do confirm more or less what you've been saying. The 2010-11 British Crime Survey showed, for example, that some 2.2 million people were using cannabis, and 1 in 6 young people took cannabis. Are you really saying to this committee that if there was a harder policy, a large number of those people would simply stop because they would be frightened of being convicted in court and go to prison?
Well, yes, but you must understand this has been a long, slow process of change, which has been very gradual. The interesting thing about the 71 Act is that it contained various mechanisms, including the ACMD, to put its provisions under constant review. And the penalties originally set out in 1971 have been substantially reduced again and again until the introduction, I say, without legislation, of the cannabis warning after the Brixton experiment of the early 1990s and the Runciman report. There has been a long, slow conveyor belt downwards during which the penalties have been reduced, and the police have found it, as a result, increasingly tiresome and time-wasting to bother enforcing a law which doesn't have any penalties. So you couldn't immediately reintroduce the provisions of 1971 and expect a revolutionary change. But what you certainly shouldn't be thinking of doing is reducing those penalties still further and imagining that by doing so you're going to make anything better. It's quite clear that during the time when penalties have been reduced, things have grown worse. And to argue, as so many people do, and I name this really the Simon Jenkins tendency above all, to say over and over and over again that we have a serious problem of over-enforced prohibition. This is failing, therefore we must resort to total decriminalisation. It's just not logical because the facts don't support it. So we have not been prohibiting cannabis or indeed the Class A drugs during that time.
So what you would be saying, Mr. Hitchens, obviously you'll correct me if I'm wrong, heaven forbid that I should put words into your mouth, but if there was a far firmer policy by government, what would be the position in effect? Is it the drug war, as it's described, would be won?
No, I don't think you can win it. That's trying to defeat human nature entirely, but you would certainly have much less drug abuse in this country. And I hope that your committee will be visiting, if it's travelling abroad, Sweden, the one European country which has not generally taken the position of harm reduction and decriminalisation, either formal or informal, and has, as a result, rather lower drug use, particularly of cannabis. than we do, or I think than any other major European country.
I doubt if there's anyone here, certainly not on this committee, and I doubt in the House of Commons, who would have any sympathy with drug taking. I would be most surprised. But be that as it may, what would be your response to the view that prohibition rarely works? And the example which is given time and again, whether it's one which you would accept, is prohibition of alcohol in the States, which collapsed totally. You would say there's no comparison between the two?
Well, you can certainly put those words into my mouth. There's an enormous difference, for instance, between, if you've got all day, we can get into the problem of alcohol, which I think in this country should be much more severely restricted. I think we should return to the 1915 licensing laws myself, at the very least. But to prohibit a drug which has been in common use for hundreds or indeed thousands of years, or in the case of the United States, had never been illegal, and to try and introduce laws prohibiting it. Laws which I might add had exactly the same failure as our anti-drug laws, in that they prosecuted supply and transport, but not possession. So to appeal to that and say that failed, therefore any attempt to not so much prohibit us, but as to interdict and discourage the use of drugs, to say that because of that one particular individual specific failure in a culture very different to our own, we can never attempt ever again in the rest of the history of the human race to try and prevent the spread of unpleasant, damaging and dangerous drugs, just seems to me to be, again, illogical and not evidence-based.
Yes. One more question. Heaven forbid, as I said before, when I should put words into your mouth.
No, please go ahead.
It was a question. There is another view, which obviously I would assume you don't accept, namely that the drug traders, those who, the arch criminals, and they're amongst the worst kind of criminals, who do their utmost to encourage people to take drugs, would they not be rather keen on a policy which governments have pursued? But if it was different, if it was legalised, decriminalised, and this is the argument which I'm not suggesting is mine, but if it was decriminalised, the drug dealers would be rather upset, to say the least.
I don't believe so. I mean, for instance, alcohol and cigarettes are both legal in this country, and yet both are either smuggled or produced illicitly by criminal gangs in this country in quite large quantities. Unless you made drugs free of charge and gave them away on street corners, there would still be plenty, and given the fact that a lot of the people who like to take drugs are, by the nature of the lives they lead, unable to afford them out of their own productive activity, the chances are there would always be an opportunity for criminal gangs. Also, it is unfair.
Presumably far fewer.
Well, no, I don't think so. There's no reason to suppose so. And what might well be the case is that if you were to legalise or decriminalise drugs entirely, that you would increase criminal activity rather than reduce it, because of this precise problem. People who want to take drugs are often the kind of people who don't particularly want to pay for them. And what the solution we come up with for this at the moment, the methadone program, and various adjuncts to that, involve instead of drug takers and abusers stealing from individuals to fund their habit, the government steals from the taxpayer to fund the habit of the drug takers, and we're told that this is some kind of advance.
Thank you. We have to move on.
If that's not organised crime, I don't know what is.
Thank you. Bridget Phillipson has a quick supplementary, then Nicola Blackwood has the final question.
Just returning to the area of education, obviously we've talked a lot about illegal drug use, but I'd be interested to hear your views about alcohol and education for young people, because often alcohol is a drug that's most easily accessible to young people and often gives rise to the most obvious harm in communities, such as antisocial behaviour. What role do you feel education has in terms of alcohol and drugs and the linkages there?
Well, I used to do the same amount of time on alcohol and tobacco as I did on the whole of the drugs. I had very little time, high academic school, very little time for anything like this. But I used to talk about alcohol in the same way and explain exactly what it does to the brain, the body and everything. One thing that used to amaze the children when I taught, I did this in year 9, which is 13 to 14, and a lot of them are never told that alcohol can actually kill them. They can overdose and the respiration muscles are suppressed and they can actually die. So you give them all the facts, the true scientific facts, whatever. You throw in a few social things and so on. And I've just approached all the whole of health education I was in charge of in the same way, in the same scientific, factual way, speaking as equals and not patronising, not talking down to them, and just explaining exactly what will happen. And that has a huge effect on children. If they know exactly how alcohol or drugs is going to affect the body, then they're with you.
Just a very small point about this. I think one thing that's very dangerous is to link legal alcohol with illegal drugs. They should be dealt with separately. The fact that some drugs are illegal should be repeatedly stressed, and to confuse the legal and the illegal drug is actually to confuse the mind of the child.
Ms. Gyngell?
Well, I certainly think that the idea that legal sanctions have no impact is, of course, not true. And I think the risk of removing those sanctions would definitely be a significant increase in use. And as Paul Hayes said to your committee the other week, at the moment, 0.6% of the population use heroin and crack, and it's a declining proportion. That means 99.4% do not. We know that only a few percent use cannabis, 2% use cocaine. The idea that you would risk increasing use and therefore increasing the demand that would then impact on countries abroad, to which we also have a moral responsibility, I find extraordinary that you would be at this point of still fairly low usage but disproportionately damaging usage that you would be thinking of putting the white flag up to use and risk it rising to levels that are something like smoking. I find this a very sort of strange way to think at all. And certainly I think with education for children on cannabis, I think the most important thing now is that we should be focusing on the domestic skunk market, which is the pressing problem in this country that's within our power to deal with. We have blithely stopped protecting children. We know skunk now causes psychosis. We don't know what's happening in gangs in South London and knife crime and what role psychosis is playing there. This is something that I think should be the pressing concern of the committee. This is stuff we can deal with here at home.
The committee is going to deal with all these issues. This is a long, detailed inquiry, and that's very helpful. Nicola Blackwood is the final question.
Thank you, Chairman. If, along the lines of this debate, more people are being convicted and sent to prison, one of the big problems that we have is the wide availability of drugs in prison, which is sort of reported and rumoured, but there's very little sort of solid evidence for. Now, I understand the Policy Exchange published a report in January which claimed that one of the big problems was corrupt staff, in particular alleging that around 1,000 corrupt members of staff were involved in this issue, which is about 7 prison officers per prison. Do you think that this is accurate? Do you have any evidence to support these claims?
We, at the Centre for Policy Studies, prior to that paper, we also published our own paper about keeping drugs out of prisons. There are a number of issues involved that could be addressed, and one very big one would be the consistent and comprehensive use of sniffer dogs. At the moment, there are not that many teams of dogs. They're laid off. It can be judged when they're on or off. There are so many holes in the system for keeping drugs out of prison. What we've done over the last few years is spent more than £100 million of introducing methadone into prisons as the first-line treatment. There have been huge worries that that itself is adding to the illicit currency, drugs currency, putting prisoners at risk. We should, or maybe you'd like to ask the question, how would it have been in those years that £100 million was spent on plugging the holes, whether it's over the wall, whether it's corrupt staff, lack of sniffer dog, lack of control over mobile phones. If the money had been spent to toughening up all those things, it would be an interesting to know what would have happened in prison since then.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchens.
It's a measure of the moral and legal disarmament of this country in the face of drug use, that in prisons, which above all should be under the controls of the law and government, we have serious drug abuse. And I think it tells you, probably more clearly than anything else, how far the de facto decriminalisation of drugs has gone in this country, that they are prevalent in our prisons.
Yes, Mr. Hitchens, you're absolutely right. Prisons are one of the areas that this committee will look at very, very carefully, and you're absolutely right to raise it with us. Do you want to add anything, Mary Brett, to Nicola Blackwood's question?
Not really, but I've got a few burning points I would
Okay,
really
could you
like
get them
to
very
make.
quickly? I have the Home Secretary hanging around in the corridor outside, and I don't want to keep her waiting any longer.
So you're putting me under pressure. One of the things
I mean, you
would
could always write to us with these points, but the main points, if you could tell us what they are.
Can I just say a few points about cannabis which are not understood? One is the strength. There's a lot of myths about the strength of it. Now, the last proper Home Office potency study was in 2008. At that time, skunk, which is 80% of our drugs, the cannabis market, was 16.2% THC, which is a psychoactive drug. Herbal cannabis in the 60s and 70s, 1-2%. You see, Frank says skunk is 2 to 4 times stronger than herbal cannabis. Wrong. The other 20%, you can hardly get herbal cannabis now, the other 20% of the market is hash, which is about 4 to 6%. Now, with this huge strength, THC strength with skunk, this is doing an awful lot more damage. The Dutch have just banned any THC over 15% because they are now looking at skunk as a hard drug, and we should be doing the same.
That is extremely helpful, and I think on the other points that you wish to raise with us, if you could write to us, that would be extremely helpful indeed. I'm afraid I'm going to have to call the session to a close because, as I say, we have other witnesses. But thank you very much for coming in, all three of you. Mr. Hitchens, Ms. Gyngell and Mrs. Brett. We may well write to you again, and please feel free to write to me if you think the committee is going off in the wrong direction. We're very keen to know this because we want to make sure that this is a very thorough inquiry and it will go on for several months. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for asking.
Order, we now switched subject and we have